Welcome back, everyone, to the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. I'm your host, Wedge. Today's episode, I'll be ranking my top 5 running backs in the NFL. Before we jump into today's episode, please make sure you press that follow button and rate the podcast right here on Spotify, as well as check out my many other episodes. Last week, I dropped my top 5 tight ends, and something to look forward to next Tuesday will be my top 5 wide receivers in the NFL. So make sure you guys go check those out. Press that follow button like I said. And with that, let's jump into my top 5 running backs in the NFL. A couple of the things that I was looking at in terms of, establishing my rankings are going to be last year's numbers for each running back, as well as the previous 3 years stats for the running backs. The reason I'm looking for that is kind of not only what they did last year, but consistency. I believe to be one of the best, you have to be able to do it year in and year out. So that is why that is a big factor in deciding my top 5 rankings here. And then something else I kind of looked at, which was last season's game highs for the running backs. I only looked at the rushing aspect of it. I know some of these running backs are very dual threat in terms of the value that they provide on the field. And then the last thing that I kind of looked at was the eye test / the fun factor. And that's basically, the big plays they're making, whether it be long runs, stiff arms, nasty jukes, or even just eye-popping games, like seeing a player have 150 yards, multiple touchdowns, as well as, a receiving touchdown, just things that open your eyes and is fun to watch, really. So, that being said, let's jump into my top 5 running backs. In the 5th ranking for my top 5 running backs, I believe coming in at 5th place is Indianapolis Colts running back Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor finds himself in the 5th spot on this list, and he still finds himself in a very odd situation with the Indianapolis Colts and their owner and the team in terms of his contract and him holding out, wanting to be paid more. Very interesting situation. I'm interested to see how it develops. So last year, Jonathan Taylor on the ground had 861 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 4.5 yards per attempt. This was considered a down year for Jonathan Taylor, especially after the year prior to that, 2021 season that Taylor had. And then receiving last year, he had 143 receiving yards, no touchdowns. But if you look at his last 3 years, that's his whole career so far. He's very young still. That's part of why the contract is going into, this phase that it's in right now, as the team is deciding, his 5th-year option, long-term extensions, what to do next, blah, yada, yada. But in the last 3 years, so throughout Taylor's career, he has 3,841 rushing yards to go along with 33 rushing touchdowns. And those yards per attempts through the past 3 seasons were 4.5, 5.5, and 5. So right at that 5 yards per attempt mark, which is very, very good in the NFL. If you're able to maintain that over a multi-year stretch like Taylor so far has. And then receiving stats over the past 3 seasons, he has 802 total receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. In 2021, I believe these numbers were good enough for Jonathan Taylor to be first-team All-Pro. So Jonathan Taylor, very good running back, kind of carries that Colts offense the past few years, as they haven't had a solid quarterback lining up beside him or in front of him, whatever formation, as well as not really any viable big-time wide receiving threats So Jonathan Taylor, gets quite a few touches and makes teams pay for it, quite honestly. His game-high stats for each category. Last season, rushing, so these aren't necessarily all from the same game. It would just be a combination of his highs. Last year would be 31 attempts for 147 yards and 1 touchdown. Like I said, this was a bit of a down year for Jonathan Taylor, and he's still coming in at 5th on this list and had 860 rushing yards last year. Taylor has played in 43 games over the past 3 seasons, and you will see, that's kind of a trend of the guys that I have in my top 5 is they're going to be the guys that are consistently on the field and consistently putting up production. So now moving on to I have 2 honorable mentions for the running backs group that did not quite make the top 5 list. And those are going to be Alvin Kamara and Austin Ekeler. Throughout the past 3 seasons, Kamara has played in only 33 games for a total of 2,727 rushing yards and 22 rushing touchdowns, as well as 1,685 receiving yards and 12 receiving touchdowns, and a second-team All-Pro within the past 3 years. So very good numbers, very good running back, just missing the cut on the top 5, as well as Austin Ekeler, who has played in 43 games, so pretty consistent in terms of his health and being available. Has 2,356 rushing yards and 26 touchdowns to go along with 1,772 receiving yards and 15 receiving touchdowns. So while he's not really getting the yards on the ground that these top 5 running backs are getting, he's very good dual threat and a touchdown machine. But he just missed the top 5 along with Alvin Kamara. So moving on to my 4th best running back on this list. And the 4th best running back in the NFL, in my opinion, is going to be New York Jets running back Dalvin Cook, who again, the running back situation is just very interesting to see how it's developing last season, this offseason, and what's going to kind of come from this season. Dalvin Cook's coming in at 4th on my list. He was let go by the Vikings this offseason. So all of these stats are from his time as a Minnesota Viking. But Dalvin Cook was released, and it took, a decent amount of time for a team to decide, we want you for a respectable number, respectable to Dalvin Cook. I believe he signed with the Jets, 1 year, $8-point-something million deal. So that's not even like crazy money, still in the single digits for being 4th best player in your position. And it took a while. And the Jets are interesting because Dalvin Cook might not even be, a clear-cut their running back 1. They have Breece Hall, who should be coming back from injury at some point within the early to mid-season, I would think, who he tore his ACL last year. But as a rookie, I believe in half a season, I want to say, he had just around 800 yards, give or take, 100 or 200 maybe, and a good amount of touchdowns. So Breece Hall will be back in the mix, as well as the guy that Breece Hall took over the job for. Michael Carter was a solid starter before last season. And, so it's going to be interesting, to see what happens with Dalvin Cook and see if, he can continue this kind of production or even this many, get the opportunity to continue this production. And we'll see if he finds himself on the top 5 running backs list next year. But last year, as a Viking, Dalvin Cook had 1,173 rushing yards to go along with 8 touchdowns on 4.4 yards per attempt, as well as 295 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns. And then over the course of the last 3 seasons, Dalvin Cook has been healthy, available for his team. He's played in 44 games, had 3,889 rushing yards to go along with 30 rushing touchdowns and yards per attempts at 4.4, 4.7, and 5. So his yards per attempt have gone down by 0.3 of a yard the past 2 seasons, but still at that 4.4 mark, which is a good number. And then receiving over the last 3 years, Cook has 880 yards to go along with 3 touchdowns. Dalvin Cook was able to do all of this. Very good numbers, 30 touchdowns on the ground within the past 3 years. And there in the Minnesota Vikings, especially the past couple of years, have pretty much been a pass-first offense. Closer to balance, but I would say at least 60 to 40 pass to run, just in terms of what you're going to expect with the weapons of Justin Jefferson. And they had Adam Thielen. They had TJ Hawkinson the second half of last season. So, a balanced offense, but I would definitely give the skew towards passing, especially with Kirk Cousins, who's been a very solid quarterback his whole career. Throwing the ball, not really the mobile type. So Dalvin Cook, game highs last season would have been 22 attempts for 119 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Dalvin Cook has had himself a very good run the past 3 years. And if you look even further back, 4 or 5 seasons, I believe he has had 1,000 plus on the ground the past 4 seasons. So that was my 4th and 5th place, with Jonathan Taylor at 5th and Dalvin Cook at 4th. And both of them have been having interesting contract situations in terms of, being paid or, being cut and waiting, several months to be signed. The third best running back on my list has not had a problem with contract situation recently, and I believe, if I remember correctly, has one of the bigger running back contracts. He signed an early extension with the Cleveland Browns, and that is Nick Chubb, coming in at 3rd on my list for the top 5 running backs in the NFL. Last year, Nick Chubb had 1,525 yards on the ground, as well as 12 rushing touchdowns. All of that on 5 yards per attempt, which is very good. Like mentioned, if you're in that 5 or close to that 5 yards per attempt mark, you're going to be a top running back if you can do that consistently and at good volume. And then receiving last year, he had 239 yards and 1 touchdown. And those stats were good enough to get Nick Chubb an All-Pro second team last season in 2022. And then we look at the past 3 years. Nick Chubb has played in 43 games. So again, consistency with, being available. And he had 3,851 rushing yards, 32 touchdowns, and then a pretty spectacular 5 yards per attempt, 5.5, and a 5.6 yards per attempt in the past 3 seasons. So the highest in yards per attempt that we've seen so far on my list here, and potentially the highest it's going to be on the list. He's going to be the highest yards per attempt. So Chubb really makes it worth it when they give him the ball. And then on the ground through the air in the past 3 years, he's had 563 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. And then just that second team All-Pro that he received for 2022. So Nick Chubb's game highs last year would have been 26 attempts for 141 yards and 3 touchdowns. Nick Chubb is a bruiser. As Ravens fan here, we definitely see him, punish the defense with, being kind of a bigger size, explosive running back, but brings the power, And Nick Chubb has made a living out of that, kind of Derrick Henry-esque, not quite the stature or the size of Derrick Henry, but similar running style, and yet still very athletic. So Nick Chubb, he's been able to do this in one of the best rushing offenses the past few years, The Browns have been right up there the past couple of years, along with the Ravens, and last year was the Bears, I believe, in terms of rushing offenses. And Chubb has been the front runner or the lead, the guy for the Browns and that rushing offense. Nothing really has seemed to stop him, and I don't really see that happening again this year with the question mark at quarterback. And while, decent wide receiver core, nothing spectacular, where they're going to be, reverting to being a pass-first offense. But moving on to the second best running back in the NFL, in my opinion, it's going to be Las Vegas Raiders running back Josh Jacobs, who last year led the league in rushing at 1,653 yards to go along with 12 touchdowns on 4.9 yards per attempt, as well as 400 receiving yards. And Josh Jacobs was unbelievable last year. It seemed like, especially that mid to second half of the season, just game after game, you're seeing ridiculous numbers. Walk-off touchdowns by him, 75-yard, overtime touchdown. Is Josh Jacobs was very eye-opening last year, and the past few years, he's been at the top of the league, I would probably say. And after last year, really doing it again for a good third straight year, has gotten himself the second best running back in the NFL. From me, in the past 3 years, Josh Jacobs has played in 46 games, so very, very reliable in terms of his availability and health. Josh Jacobs has 3,590 rushing yards, 33 rushing touchdowns, and averages of 4.9, 4, and 3.9, as well as 986 receiving yards. And then last year, I forgot to mention, but last year Josh Jacobs was first team All-Pro at the running back position, deservingly so, after the number of spectacular performances that he put up. Josh Jacobs did this. With the Raiders, and the Raiders have a solid receiving core. Not top of the game, but they had Devontae Adams, Hunter Renfrow, who had quite a bit of a down year, actually. But Adams is one of the best wide receivers in the league, and Josh Jacobs was still able to get his own from the running back position. So Josh Jacobs, definitely one of the best running backs in the league. I put him as second. I expect that he's going to have continued success. They didn't really upgrade at the quarterback position. They have Garoppolo now, but I really don't see that being too different from Derek Carr. So I'm not guessing that, the run to pass ratio is going to change, or, I don't think that you're going to take the ball out of Jacobs' hands, especially in big situations, because of who you have at quarterback, like you may with some quarterbacks, regardless of your running back. I would probably suggest that all the top 5 quarterbacks that are going to be on my list that'll drop 2 weeks from today, those are the kind of guys that you're not going to, if it's fourth and short, fourth in the game, whatever, you're not handing the ball off. But I don't think Jimmy Garoppolo pulls that attention away from Josh Jacobs, even with a wide receiver like Devontae Adams as an option. So moving on to my number one running back in the NFL. This one, after hearing the list up to this point, should come as no surprise. Number one running back in the NFL, Derrick Henry. Last year had 1,538 rushing yards and 13 touchdowns on the ground at 4.4 yards per attempt, as well as 398 receiving yards. Derrick Henry has played in 40 games the past 3 seasons and has a total of 4,502 yards, 40 rushing touchdowns, all on yards per attempt at 4.4, 4.3, and 5.4, as well as 666 receiving yards over the past 3 seasons. And in 2020, he was not only first team All-Pro as a running back, but also the 2020 Offensive Player of the Year after he had something like 1,700 rushing yards. It was crazy. And then if you look at his game highs last year, they actually all came in one game in this case, which was Week 7 against the Houston Texans, where Derrick Henry rushed 32 times for 219 yards and 2 touchdowns. Derrick Henry is unbelievable. The amount of big plays that he breaks off, the amount of broken tacklers that he creates and continues to run hard after. I want to say that Derrick Henry, I don't know, not last year, but 2 years ago, and potentially last year and 2020. So really all of his past 3 years, the top 10 or 15 players rushing yards, Derrick Henry's been up there, top 3, top 5. And then if it's Derrick Henry after contact, is still in that, I want to say 1 year he was within even the top 5 again with just his yards after contact. But, top 10 with him after contact, which is crazy to see. Also, working in Derrick Henry's case, on the Titans, even with A.J. Brown, not this previous season, but the 2 years before that, I would say that's the one team out of these, top 5 running backs, potentially the Colts and Jonathan Taylor, potentially, but I wouldn't even say he's dominant like that in terms of how Derrick Henry is. But, the past 3 years, if they need a big play, or if it's crunch time, or the entire second half of the third quarter and the entire fourth quarter, the whole defense knows that Derrick Henry is getting the ball, and they still cannot stop him, and he still runs over people and breaks tackles and continues to put up insane production at the running back position. So that's why he's number 1, in my opinion. So just to recap, coming in at first, Derrick Henry. Second, Josh Jacobs. Third, Nick Chubb. Fourth, Dalvin Cook. Fifth, Jonathan Taylor, with the honorable mentions of Alvin Kamara and Austin Eckler. That's all I have today for my top 5 running backs in the NFL. Please make sure you press that follow button right here on Spotify. That way you can see when I post new episodes. As well as check out the Instagram if you'd like, at Wedge52Gridiron. Thank you all for watching, or listening, I should say, and go Ravens.